Wat speelt er precies rondom de boeren en vissers? Wat is het grotere plaatje, de historische context? Dat en meer wordt beschreven in het onderzoeksrapport De Nederlandse boeren en vissers ondermijning van eigendomsrecht en de voedselvoorziening, dat nu gratis te downloaden is op de site koers2030.nl. De bevindingen van het onderzoek laten zien dat het noodzakelijk is een maatschappelijk debat te voeren over voedselzekerheid, eigendomsrecht en ondernemersvrijheid. En dat discussies over natuur en stikstof afleiden van de kern van de zaak. Wil je weten waarom boeren van het land af moeten en de vissers van de zee? Hoe het komt dat boeren en vissers bereid zijn het beroep op te geven dat al generaties lang in de familie is? Dat de achtergrond van wereldwijde natuurbeschermingsmaatregelen in feite een verkapte onteigeningsagenda is. Wat de ruilverkaveling met Natura en smart cities te maken heeft. Waarom het bijna onmogelijk is je eigen woongemeenschap te starten. Waarom meer dan de helft van de wereldbevolking in steden woont. Dit is een historisch unicum. Waarom lokale, zogenaamd regionale en nationale overheden VN-beleid uitvoeren en NGO's of maatschappelijke organisaties steeds meer land onder hun beheer krijgen. Wat de gevolgen van dit alles zijn voor de voedselvoorziening. Wil je dit weten? Ga dan naar koers2030.nl en download het rapport.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Solari Report. I am in Friesland with Elze van Hamelen, the Dutch reporter who wrote our blockbuster Pharma Food, and we have a new blockbuster. We're here to talk about the Dutch farmers and fishermen. For many, many months, everybody's been asking, what's really going on with the Dutch farmers and fishermen? But because I knew what was happening was so much part of all these other things that we've been covering in the food series and in geopolitics and the control grid at the Solari Report. I knew this was a big one. So I came to you and said, would you do another blockbuster? And this is something you are absolutely going to want to look at. And I'm going to start with the end in mind, because our message from Pharma Food is also our message from the Dutch farmers and fishermen. And that is, you must secure, well, why don't you tell us what the message is?
You must secure access to your food. And if it's not for the farmers, it's for your own security. Because,
So access to good, healthy, nutritious, fresh food is critical. And you must take responsibility to do it. Yes. You know, to find it, to grow it, to finance it, to whatever. For everybody it's different, but you have to do it.
Yes.
This is a matter of life and death. The other thing is, you know, I'll be really blunt. There is a group of people who are trying to, or let me say it this way. So we have a planet full of real assets, the land, the water, the livestock, all the different, the businesses, the technology, the equipment. So we have a world of real assets. And for decades, we've been putting everybody into this debt control system where we pile more and more paper. It's called the debt growth model. And we've piled more and more paper on top of those real assets. And now that the debt growth model is over, there's a dive for who controls the real assets.
Yes.
Particularly because there's been so much criminality going on in the paper. So now the game is who controls the real assets. And there are 1,000 different games going on, all to grab and control the real assets.
Yes.
And it's fair to say that the other message from the Dutch farmers and fishermen is there are 1,000 games to steal your land and real estate, and you cannot let that happen.
Yes.
Right.
Because also, if you own nothing, you become a slave.
Right.
The ownership and the property, that's the basis for autonomy and wealth generation. And if you don't have that, you become completely dependent.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I loved is you started your piece off with a quote from John Rappaport. I'm just going to read it because I love these interviews with Ellis Medavoy. So this is Ellis Medavoy, who's a propaganda expert, talking to John. He says, not long after we met for the first time, Medavoy said to me, quote, I can tell you how to run a world, you know. I laughed. Really? Sure, he said. You make up something complicated. Then you insert it into the bloodstream of society and you watch it bloom. You make it complex enough that it will take armies of people to sort it out and argue about it, and then you have them. The other thing is what you make up has to cost money, a lot of money. And then you have another quote from the head of the Dutch Farmers Defense Force, quote, "They keep changing the rules of the game."
Yes.
Right. And so that's why it takes a real blockbuster to look at the thing whole and bring it down and see the simple morals of the story to do risk management. And anyway, so I just want to compliment you. You've done an extraordinary job.
Thank
you. Know
you.
It took a lot of work. Okay, so before we begin, I just want you to give a few words about how you got interested in all the different food aspects and then what you learned from doing pharma food.
So I used to be a sustainability consultant, and that was with chemical companies. But with that, I always felt this as if we went away from nature too much. So even though I didn't work in it, I was always fascinated by nature, because I thought if we really want to do something I don't want to use the word anymore, but sustainable, like in the right way, then I feel we need to have this reconnection again. And I thought the reconnection really starts with people and the land and working together with the land in a certain, different philosophical attitude. So it always had my interest. And then you asked me for pharma food. Yeah, that was interesting to study.
Well, it's shocking to see, because you hear all this stuff about we have to be sustainable, we have to be efficient. And then you see them making processed food that was like the $18 hamburger. It's so bizarre. It takes you into bizarre world. So I should just point out for everybody that the pharma food, the whole pharma food presentation is available in PDF on the website, and we're sending it to the printer next week, so it'll be out in hard copy shortly. And I would strongly recommend that before you read this one, you read pharma food, just to...
Yeah, they're really, they go together.
They go together. Yes. They go together. So anyway, but you have certainly mapped out a lot of what is going on in the food system, whether it's the destruction of the old, or the invention of bizarre world new, or the invention of new that is quite wonderful.
Yes,
so there's a whole thing happening in regenerative farming that is wonderful, which is why if you go looking for fresh food, there's hope.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's just dive in. Let's start with the Dutch farmers and fishermen. So the world is watching. We're all very interested in what's happening. There's been a lot of PR. You've been out and talked with a series of both the farmers and fishermen.
Yes.
So tell us about your conversations.
So both of them, I call this the policy tsunami, like because the farmers were in the news because of the nitrogen regulations. But if you ask about what happened, they will talk about all the different other policies that have hit them before this. And then there's a lot of administrative burden. So there's so many rules to comply by that a lot of them need to hire accountants just to make sure that they comply with legislation. So they say, we feel like criminals, like if you do a little bit wrong, then you're already running into a lot of problems. And for the fishermen, the fishermen perhaps have it even more rough than the farmers.
Right.
So that's... I found that painful to
So one of the things I didn't understand that you taught me was the farmer, many of the Dutch, first of all, we should say Netherlands is a food juggernaut.
Yes.
I mean, you're talking about a country with 17 million people, about half the land has been recaptured from the sea, and yet it's the second largest or third largest exporter of food in the world, which is incredible.
Yes, but it's not all produced on the soil. Yeah,
right.
But it's
some of it comes out.
Yes,
yeah. And you see these huge greenhouses as you drive around. So it's, but needless to say, whether it's the throughput coming, through the ports, or what's being grown here, the Netherlands is a food juggernaut.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also at the heart of farming developments. Also the industrial farming, the precision farming, the AI farming, designing of machinery.
Right.
It's also a very innovative country in this respect.
Yeah. So you have a combination of farming and engineering.
Yes.
And it's funny because the farmers here, in Friesland, there are plenty of farmers. Mm-hmm. The farmers here are much more, they're much different than the U.S. farmers.
Really?
Yeah, because they're much more part of the community. Uh-huh. They're much more admired and respected. It's a very respected group of people in my experience.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. So,
yes, that's my experience too. I live in a rural area, but one of the farmers I interviewed, Alex Brouwer, he said, when you listen to the radio, you hear them talking very negatively about farmers the whole time. Right. And he said, I have a wife and a family and I can talk with people, but if you hear this the whole time, you start feeling bad about yourself, and especially the farmers that are doing the work by themselves or perhaps don't have like a tight social circle. Right. It really weighs on them.
Yes.
And he started selling milk at his house. And one thing he really liked about that, he said, usually the truck comes by and the milk goes and that's it. But now these people come to my farm and they make a conscious decision that they want to buy this milk at my farm. So I meet all these new people that are really supportive, that want to understand what I'm doing. But it also really feels, he feels supported by that. So it's not just,
Right. The media beatdown is part of the game.
Yeah.
So it was by talking with you that I discovered, all the farmers in the Netherlands who got on the industrial model got put on the industrial model essentially by the same guys who are playing the game and saying they're bad because they're an industrial model.
Yes.
So tell us about how that all happens.
Where do I need to start?
Well, we come out of World War II, and basically there was a shock doctrine, gut-wrenching re-engineering of farmers and how farming worked in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. Thank you, U.S. and Marshall Plan, right?
Definitely. So the Dutch countryside, it was made up of all these tiny plots of land, so very small areas, and each farmer would own multiple areas that they would work together with land workers. And the government thought there was a small farmers problem because all these tiny plots of land, and you also have to imagine this was highly biodiverse. So you didn't have barbed wire yet, so it was all, there were hedges around these plots, or there were meandering brooks. There were pieces of land that they couldn't, that wasn't arable, so you would have little marshes and peat bogs and sandy areas. So it was super biodiverse, but it wasn't suitable for mechanized agriculture.
Right.
So there were already for 50 years plans for more land consolidation. Also to make it more efficient, there was reason for improvement. But there wasn't a readiness for large-scale government intervention. And there was hesitancy about going into people's ownership rights, property rights.
Right.
And then after the Second World War, so in the Netherlands, in the last year of the World War, it was a very, very cold winter, and there was a blockage of food by the Nazis. So especially the west of the country suffered a really horrible famine. A lot of people perished, but this is very ingrained in the Dutch consciousness. It's called the hunger winter.
Right.
So after the World War, a lot of land is destroyed, farms are destroyed, the cattle was robbed. They had a deficit in the trade balance, so they had difficulty buying things.
Right.
Everything was, a lot of food was still on food stamps, even a couple of years after the war. So there was a rallying cry, no more hunger. And now we need to do something about the small farmers problem, and we need to start land consolidation processes. So for the Dutch people, this word is ruilverkaveling. Ruil means trade, and kavel is a plot, so trade of plots, but it's translated as land consolidation.
Right.
And this became like an enormous a modernization project but it was basically run as a social engineering program.
Right.
And I found out that it was financed by Marshall Aid money.
Right.
And the Marshall Aid was part money and machineries and resources, but for a large extent also knowledge export. And so there was the U.S. State Department had a program where, because there was, the condition for the Marshall Aid was also European cooperation.
Right.
And there was resistance to this, to start working with the Germans again. So there were programs from the State Department to speak with businessmen, with politicians, with everyone who is in a kind of like an influential position to nudge them to a pro-American viewpoint.
Right.
And then for this land consolidation, they thought they kind of considered the rural population as backwards.
Right.
So they said, well, we need to teach them how to run a modern household. So there was at some point like one advisor per 400 farmers on how to run the farm. Because all this land consolidation, you needed fewer farmers. So they would give career advice to farmers' sons. They would they specifically targeted the farmers' wives in the
Right.
training. And then they just started consolidating this land, and in this process, 75% of the country was flattened.
But was it 75% of the farmers removed out of farming or off the land?
They don't have clear numbers on that, but so this process takes on decades. But by the 90s, 75% of the whole country has been part of one of these land consolidation efforts.
Right, so it's huge.
And they removed 225,000 kilometers of hedges.
Wow.
And it was what was left was replaced by barbed wire. But what these hedges do, hedges are extremely biodiverse. So they will harbor the little mammals, they will harbor the birds. If there are a lot of insects, things will grow on the edges of the meadows. So hedges are extremely biodiverse, but all of this was just taken away. There's actually a movement now to reinstall a large part of the hedges, because some say like we don't need to give all this land back to nature, but if we just replace some of this barbed wire by hedges again, we can have some of the biodiversity without having to move the...
Well, if you look at the spin, part of what they're saying, so you move farmers out of regenerative farming into industrial farming, and now you come back and you say, industrial farming is very bad. We need to go to regenerative farming, or just take the land back. Just take the land back to nature. And one of the things you point out is the transition takes much longer than 1 year. You can't do it. It's a slow transition, because not only are you changing your farming practices, but you're moving from one economic model to the other.
Yes.
And the last economic model has put you in a huge debt trap.
Yes.
So, and if you look at how they're spinning it, it sounds all well and good, but it's totally It's just, they're running ahead on the farmers.
Yes, and also because the government is right now stimulating the hedges part, but what happens then to farmers is that they place these hedges, they are maintaining nature, and then they say, well, we have this endangered species there now, and now there needs to be a buffer zone and you have to reduce your cows. So it's dangerous to kind of like increase the biodiversity, because before you know it, you're in some protective area and they will stop you from doing your work.
So I want to ask you about phosphate and nitrogen. I don't know if it can be done quickly, but they basically have, this is a gaslighting operation, and the gaslighting goes with multiple rules and regulations that are all designed to bankrupt them so you can get a hold of the land. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but that's how it works. And two of the gaslightings are around phosphate and nitrogen. So tell us about that.
I'll take it back a little bit. So you have this industrial model is introduced, and then they say, we need to give land back to nature. So there is a separation. Man is bad for nature, and we need to protect nature. Well, before farmers are still taking care of nature. But then you get this surplus production, because that had to do with the trade balance. But you have this surplus production against very low prices. So these farmers need to scale up to just stay in business. And then you get this surplus production, but it creates issues on the world market. So it was a very protected market with milk quota from the EU for decades. And then I think it was in 2009, they said, we are going to let go of these milk quota. And then all the advisors, so the financial advisors, the farmers' education, the experts came by, and they tell all the farmers, this is your chance, you need to grow, you can grow a lot now, just take on a little bit more depth. And it was already clear that by letting these farms grow by this much, it would increase the phosphate emissions, because it has to do with the more cows is more manure. And if you have a regenerative farm, then your amount of cows fits with the soil that you have.
Right, and the manure gets recycled.
Yes.
Right.
But if you're just growing your cattle stock, then you get an excess of manure. And because I think they passed the legislation in 2009, and then it went into effect March 31st in 2015. And then July 1st, 2015, they say, there's an excess of phosphate emissions. We need to do something about this. And all the farmers get allocated an emissions quota based on their current stock. And
classic double bind.
Yes.
Right.
But the farmers that were hit most by this were the regenerative farmers that didn't even have a phosphate problem, because they could do everything on their own land. So one of the former farmers we interviewed, John Bergerman, he was in the transition of a regular farm to an organic farm. And then usually your production gets a hit. So he had a year of very low production, which they took into account. But he got an emissions quota based on this low production. And then they said, you have too many cows. You have to get rid of more than 30 of your cows. And he says, that was what we needed to generate a decent income. And they were in lawsuits for 2 years. And basically they said, no, this is entrepreneurial risk. But he said, we are exactly the farm that they want. They're regenerative, they're organic, everything is in the soil. He didn't even have a phosphate problem, because even though they got this low emissions quota.
Well, I will say they want farms that make money for insiders.
Yes, definitely. So that was the phosphate,
So let me take a break in a second and describe the fact that part of our challenge here, and you see it with the Dutch farmers and you see it in the Netherlands, and it's a perfect example or case study, is we have a society and a group of people who are being targeted in a very dirty, vicious game.
Yes.
And they can't see it whole. It's too complicated. It's too, we're all focused on our piece. So I'm a farmer, I'm a fisherman, and we can't fathom that there's a group of people who've decided, as the World Economic Forum states openly, it's 2030, you have no assets. That means we're going to take all your assets, starting with your land. And they just can't believe that this is a plan.
Yes.
And of course it's a plan. So I come from, we were talking about this earlier, I come from a world where if you're running large amounts of global investment, you have to plan 50 to 100 years. I used to work with people who planned 100 years forward. That's how you did it, and everything was connected. So you had to, and that's how you talked. You talk about, okay, well, we'll do the energy in this country, and we'll do, and so things are very centralized, and they're very mapped out, and they're very clear about these policies. And when they decide, okay, we're going to consolidate all the land in the Netherlands, you never say, okay, well, we're going to pass a law that dictates that. They're going to say, how can we do it in a way that makes us money? So it's not how can I go to Rome, it's how can I get everybody going to Rome with me in a way that makes us money. And then the policies are all engineered. And then, of course, it comes down in these different lines. So the health guys are doing this, and the media guys are doing this, and the bankers are doing this, and the government's doing this, and everybody's in their little box. But of course it's planned. It's very hard to manage the whole planet. You have to think ahead. You have to plan. So, but what I find in the Netherlands is many people in this whole ecosystem can't fathom that this is part of a plan, even though the World Economic Forum keeps announcing it. So tell us about what you found in terms of people understanding that this is really a plan.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if you see at this land consolidation, the superficial story is no more hunger, we need to solve this, we're going to produce a lot, and that's a success story. But if you dive a little bit deeper, then it came from the Marshall money, so it came from the US. And around that same time, the US made it its foreign strategy to become a dominant player, the global player in world food production.
Right.
And that food production was considered a strategic aim of foreign policy. So it's a power policy. This was not about solving hunger.
Did you ever read Global Harvest? We did.
No.
We did a huge wrap-up many years ago called Global Harvest that looked at sort of the food juggernaut of the Anglo-American Alliance.
Oh, I never saw it.
And how it worked, and who was a food net exporter, who was a food net importer. And it was clear if you looked at what they had done after World War II and how it had grown, that the Anglo-American Alliance basically said, we're going to dominate food. And of course, the Dutch are a very big, important piece of the, they're very close to the UK and that whole world.
And if you look behind that, then you see it was really influenced by the Rockefellers, who already started doing a lot of projects in the industrial food production, kind of in the interbellum, like already in the Second World War, but also in the period before that. And then this model of industrial agriculture gets exported to the global south as the Green Revolution, and it gets exported to Europe as part of the Marshall Plan. But if you look at the business model that they're introducing, it's a complete diversion from the business model that's been around for thousands of years of farming, because they pull everything apart. Like the traditional farming model, you produce everything on your soil. So it's a mixed farm, it's a regenerative farm, it's connected to the community. And then they in name of efficiency and modernization and rationalization and mechanization, or those words keep on turning up, then they say, well, it's more efficient if we have the cattle separate from the arable land. And then the arable land, you need all these inputs, like the fertilizers and the seeds and knowledge. And so they pull everything apart to where the farm was really like a basis for like one of the most autonomous ways to exist, like on your own piece of land. It becomes a financial operation that's dependent on capital and that's dependent on inputs from the world market. So
it becomes easy to control.
Very easy to control.
Did you read Jacob Nordgaard's book on the Rockefellers?
I ordered it when I ran into this research. I haven't finished it yet, but yes.
It's very helpful.
Yes.
In this regard. Okay, so let's turn. So you interviewed a series of farmers. You also interviewed a series of fishermen.
Wait, but because about this plan, so it's the Rockefellers, they kind of come up with this model. It gets exported through foreign policy, but worldwide. And
through the banking system, right.
But then what happens as a result of the introduction of this model is that the countryside is emptied. So you get a surge in urbanization and really upheaval of the whole countryside, also on a cultural level. And what happens, so in the West, these people that go into the cities, they get adopted into the industrialized model and the economic boom of after the World War. But in the global South, they end up in slums, in appalling conditions.
Right.
So in 1976, the UN starts a conference. It's called Habitat 1. And they want to focus on like how can we manage human settlement to deal with this surge in urbanization. And perhaps we can talk about that later. But if you talk about the planning, basically they call upon all governments to develop policies for land use. And they say private property is an issue. So all land needs to be managed in the public interest. And they set out a whole list of policies and taxes that they can implement to get control over the land and redistribute people over the land.
Right.
And they're very open in what they plan to achieve, because I think the tricky thing with the Agenda 21 and the Sustainable Development Goals now is if you don't know what's lying underneath it, you read it and you think, these are wonderful goals. Who wouldn't want this? And nobody will read further. And I actually have felt for this as well. But in this specific declaration, they're so clear about what they're intending and that it's an attack on private property. Yes. So it shows the planning.
So if you look at, so basically in the U.S., you've taken agricultural down to less than 1% of the population producing the food. Mm-hmm. And if you look, when we did Global Harvest, if you looked at China and India, it was 35% and I think 48%, somewhere around there, still farming. And when you listen to Sir James Goldsmith talk about globalization and the fact that their goal is to take those numbers down to 1% too, and what that would do in terms of moving people into the slums in the cities or depopulation. I mean, he gives a very, I don't know if you remember that description, but he gives an eloquent description of how entirely mad this is. I mean, it's just total madness.
It's a control agenda.
Right.
Yes.
But it's a control agenda that will, it's so harmful. I was really struck by your description of the farmers living together in a community and then being reorganized so that now they're all individual, separate.
Yeah.
And what a cultural, that must have been absolutely gut-wrenching.
Yes.
Right. Okay, well, nobody ever said my old partners were nice people. Okay, ready to go into the fishermen? Okay. So, of course, we're in a fishing community, right, or a sailing community right now, so I love the fishermen. But if you look at all the different tricks they've played on the fishermen, and I agree with you, it sounds to me like it's even worse than what they've done to the farmers.
And more effective. Because,
What you're watching, because the fish is fabulous here. And the whole North Sea, the wealth of the North Sea really was driven by fish being taken out of the sea. I mean, it's extraordinary, the history of the fishing and the wealth that's created along the North Sea. But you watch these hideous windmills going up throughout the IJsselmeer, and then the farmers being told they can't fish because that would be, in other words, the ocean is being grabbed for wind farms that, if my understanding of the energy is right, are far from economic or efficient. And basically, if you look at where the energy is going, it's going to fuel the control grid.
Yes.
So we are swapping healthy, nutritious fish and happy, productive, profitable fishermen for basically, Bitcoin and CBDC. Is that?
Yeah, that would be a good summary. Yeah. And
it's oversimplified, but it's...
No, and similar with the farmers is we still have a very small amount of people who know how to get food, like with farmers how to grow food or how to manage cattle, and with the fishermen how to fish. And they're really making it so impossible for them to just let them do their job that they're putting their towel in the ring. But it's undermining our access to food in a very fundamental way. And the farmers and the fishermen realized it. And they also say people are so used from getting their food from a supermarket that they cannot think that these supermarkets can be empty. They don't think about who's taking care of their food.
Right.
But they will notice when the problems arise. So with the fishermen, first you had Brexit, so they were losing fishing grounds.
Right.
Then there were already these windmills, but they were offshore wind parks, but they are like expanding these in a very insane way. So there were already plans a couple of years ago for expansion, and then the next plan. But now in April they said the whole of North Sea. So that's not just the Dutch part. There need to be 30,000 windmills along the North Sea coast in 2050. So that's really an insane.
So if you look at the energy return on energy invested in the windmills, it can't, to me, it makes no economic sense. But if you look at the calculations, they're assuming that in 15 or 20 years, it's not going to be expensive to deal with the fact that you've got 30,000 windmills that need to be replaced or put in a landfill, or I don't know what they're planning on doing with these things when their expected life is out, but it could be an environmental disaster.
Could be, no, very certain. So the other thing is, even if they will take the windmills away, they put enormous amounts of concrete in the bottom of the sea, and the fishermen can't fish there anymore because it will destroy their nets.
Right.
And the whole business case around these windmills is extremely fishy.
Right.
It just doesn't make any sense. That's why I described it as economic warfare. Like, it's blowing up the energy system. It's extremely costly. It's extremely polluting.
Right.
It's damaging and changing the sea ecosystems. And there are even, I found some research, I think I quoted one of them. So these windmills change the winds around the coast. And so that has effect on the formation of clouds. So there is some reason to assume that is creating droughts on land. And it's also affecting the waves that come to the shore, and especially in this part, like the lower parts of the ocean, the fish use it to spawn. So they really don't know what kind of like ecosystem effects it will have on the longer term, like on the whole marine ecosystem.
So when you talk with people in the Netherlands, they say we have to do this so we're not dependent on Russian gas. Is that true?
Yes. But it's not replacing gas.
Right.
It cannot be a replacement in any way.
So when you see these things, a lot of the energy, my understanding, is going to basically the big data centers.
Yes, so simultaneously with where they're placing the windmills, they say, well, because of the cool climate, that's a good place to put the data centers, and the expectations for energy use for the data centers is skyrocketing because the Internet of Things and 5G and AI. So you need this enormous data storage and processing capacity. And so I think it was in Ireland, they wouldn't onboard like new data centers because they were already using too much energy. So they're placing these new data centers near where they're also planning the windmills. But again, these windmills are not providing stable energy.
Right.
they don't have a solution for that. So,
right. In the United States, we were just looking at a company. And we'll get to monetary policy. The inflation and interest rates have destroyed. I mean, the economics were bad enough of wind, but then the inflation and interest rate is destroying it. But you come back and you keep walking around this ecosystem. So as I read the Van Hamelen blockbusters, I'm walking around this ecosystem, and you have all these things going on which are economically insane. But then they keep sort of gaslighting the farmers and fishermen with, oh, well, you're not economic for this little thing and this little. But in the meantime, you're watching this whole system, which is so wildly uneconomic, whether it's the windmills or the pharma food and the, 3D printed sirloin steaks with. I mean, it's so. Anyway.
Well, it's all these little things. But even with you recorded this conversation with Ulrike, control happens one by one. But even with the farmers, if you're not near this protected nature area in a buffer zone, then you're not in too much trouble. So it's a selection of the farmers that is targeted. With the phosphate emissions, it was a small amount of, or not small amount, but it were the regenerative farmers that were undue hit by these regulations. And so for each of them, each time it's a different type of regulation. So everyone feels that it's their personal problem.
Right.
And there's also some divide between the farmers that are in the industrial model or who are more in a regenerative model, because each time that a farm chose for scale enlargement, there were a lot of other farms that went bankrupt because they can't get by if they don't go for the enlargement as well. So a lot of farms were lost because a couple of ones stayed in business. So I see that some of the small farms that are struggling to get by still, they say, well, they've chosen all this debt. So if they're now running into problems, that's kind of what they're, it's their own responsibility.
And part of it is that I don't think they understand the full gaslighting involved.
No.
And the double binds involved. I don't think they, and that gets back to what Rappaport's saying about complexity. Yes. Complexity protects the plant.
And also from the Second World War on, it's the education that says you need to use a lot of fertilizer, you need to run your farm in this way. It's the banks, then there are these advisors companies, but basically everyone in the community believes that the industrial model that created the food surplus production, that's what you need to do. Small farming will never help you get there. And I also spoke to a couple of farmers that are running their like the regenerative model, but they almost feel a little bit, they say, the community looks strangely at them for choosing something else. Like, no, why aren't you building a larger stable? Why aren't you expanding? But it's a sensitive topic. It's a sensitive topic because everyone is kind of locked in their own model, and it's also used as a divide and conquer.
Yeah, and the divide and conquer. The last thing we have to mention is part of the excuse is we need to take land back to nature.
Yes.
So there's and it's different in every place, but here there's wilderness areas, there's nature protection, there's all sorts of reasons why we have to be good to nature by taking your land, but meantime we're destroying everything by doing the wind farms or so on one hand we're doing things which are environmental disasters, but on the other hand we're insisting we can take your land to help nature because you're bad for nature. Okay, so I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about nature protection, but that's
a very important one.
Right.
Because after this whole land consolidation, they say, well, we destroyed a lot of nature here. And then they said, we need to start consolidating land and give it back to nature. And then the environmental NGOs, they were allowed to manage those pieces of land, but you can't run a farm there anymore.
Right.
And this idea of putting nature into protected areas, it kind of flows out indirectly from this Habitat Convention. So Habitat 1 in 1976. And it really becomes a part of international treaty in the Rio Declaration in 1992, and there they devised the Biodiversity Convention.
Right.
And there they say you need to put land into protected areas, and the land around these areas need to be managed as well. Well, I won't go into all the details, but that leads to the ecological network model. And the ecological network model talks about these protected areas, a buffer zone, and it's connected by corridors. But between the 90s and 2005, hundreds of these areas get implemented throughout the whole world. Right. So in the US, this is the Wildlands Project. In the EU, this is called Natura 2000. But it's from Russia, Asia, South America, everywhere in the world. It's everywhere. It goes under different names. In the EU, it's part of the EU legislation process.
Right.
But in a lot of other countries, it's implemented through NGOs. So it's kind of like a stealth attack, because they pose as civil society and nature protection. But if you look at the details, they have a special consultative status at the UN. And they're basically working on behalf of the UN to implement UN policy.
Well, they get top-down funding, but they're not subject to any kind of economic accountability. And so you get, and you also have people, you have a lot of people who are young or fervent and have no idea what the whole game is. Right.
So because Pete Kennedy, he interviewed the owner of Drake's Oyster Bay.
Right, great interview. Yeah.
Yes, but if you listen to what happened to them, that's a personal story of what happens to somebody who is exposed in the type of legislation and the program that I discuss here.
Right.
Because for him, it was the same thing. Like suddenly he's in a protected area and they say you're being bad for nature, even though they've been running a perfectly good business, taking care of nature, and he gets all these environmental NGOs running media hate campaigns. And that's kind of like the governance structure that I describe in this report.
Right. Part of what has to happen is the general population needs to become immune to the media game. And they're not yet.
No, that's a very... And start... so when you read media, assume that somebody is trying to influence you. So who do you want to be influenced by?
Right.
So choose your sources very, very carefully.
Right.
And then if you read mainstream media, of legacy media, keep that in the back of your mind. What is it that they're trying? What is the narrative that they're trying to sell? Because each time it's a narrative. It's not a piece of information that helps you make a good decision. They promote a narrative because they want to steer you in a certain direction.
Right. So they're not giving you a good map, and they're not helping you with risk management.
No, definitely.
Okay. So we've been talking about the policy tsunami that's been torturing the farmers and fishermen, whether it's phosphate or nitrogen, or land management or nature conservation, or there are many different things. We didn't talk about the discards.
Oh,
the discards, one of the before we go to the next thing, because when I read the discards, it was hard not to cry. It was really hard not to cry. So tell us about the discards.
So when fishermen fish, not all the fish is suitable for sale. So it was first Brexit and the protected nature areas. Right. They're not allowed to fish there. And then there are the windmills. And then there is the discard. So the discard that they fish, and then a part of the fish they cannot sell it, so they will put it overboard. And most, or at least half of that fish is still alive, and it swims away. And now the EU says, well, that's really unsustainable, because we want you to catch fewer discards. You need to bring everything on land. So there's a landing obligation. And so what Peke Wouda, one of the fishermen that we interviewed, said, he said, it's insane, because if you put this fish overboard, it's still alive. You shouldn't bring that. So that's young fish. It needs to swim. But now, because they don't trust the fishermen in bringing that fish back to land, they have voted that the cameras need to be installed on the boat. And these fishermen already tracked, this is another interesting, they're already tracked by GPS for decades. When they weigh fish, there are special sensors for that. When any wire is loose, they will get a letter from the ministry that they're not in compliance. What's interesting too is that these fishermen, they know where the currents go, where they can find the fish, but because of the GPS, the government knows exactly where they are and where they're fishing. And what I noticed that a couple of fishermen said, it's very interesting that each time they want to start these protected areas in the areas where we fish.
Ah, see, yeah.
So there's a landing obligation. And then there were the fuel prices, because after the war in Ukraine, the prices went through the roof. And it really adds to the cost of your operation, because these boats use a lot of fuel. And at the end of the line, so all these things are happening. And if you look at all the policy documents...
Right, and their equipment, in other words, you're saying you have to put in a new motor that just happens to cost 150,000 euro, you know.
Oh, yeah, and then they need to make these investments. So there's a difference. So there is the smaller boats, those are like shrimp fisheries and smaller fishery near the coast and on the IJsselmeer. Then you have the North Sea boats, those are the bigger boats. And then there are the boats on the open ocean, on the non-territorial waters. So the shrimp fishery, they are fishing in protected areas. And now they say you need to invest in a catalyzer. Yeah. Right. And in a new engine, and if you don't do that, you don't get a new permit. But each of these is 100K per investment for a small one-man business. Business,
Dead
yes.
trap. Yeah.
And then for the this is so in 2010 the Sunwing. So these fisheries, they draw some of the nets they disturb the bottom, and then the fish in the bottom flies up and they catch this fish. But because they stir the bottom, it costs a lot of energy.
Right.
So they got together with an engineer, and basically there's a whole story on how they draw this out in a discussion in a bar. But they had this new innovation where they would have very low voltage electrical pulse. So you don't need to disturb the bottom. That's another thing that the nature protection agencies, they say, well, the fishermen are destroying nature. So you don't need to disturb the soil anymore. And there's a very low electrical pulse, and the fish is startled by it, and it's caught. And it's called Sunwing. It's a kind of like, it's devised in such a way that the fuel cost was reduced by more than 50%.
Right.
So they got a temporary permit to use this. There was a lot of research. They want sustainability prices because fewer emissions, lower fuel cost, less bycatch, so the landing obligation thing. They can catch fish in a very directed manner.
So naturally they had to outlaw this.
Yes. And they did. Because they won these prizes, the research supported it. But the French fisheries, they have much older boats. They are smaller, but they have a lot of political clout in the EU. So there was this whole campaign about electrocuted fish and destroying nature. And then it was forbidden. But all these fishermen have invested in this.
Right.
And again, I think it was 150,000 investment for a not too big boat. But that's also like, imagine like the fuel prices going through the roof, and you have something in storage that you knew that this can halve the cost of my fuel price right now, and you're forbidden to use it.
Right.
But that's the entrepreneurial risk. No, but now the worst thing I think about the fishermen, because that was something. So after all of this, they say to these fishermen that run the North Sea boats, they say, well, we offer a subsidy if you turn in your boat. And But the condition is that you won't start a fishery in the next 5 years. You will turn in your fishing quota, which they invested a long time into to get their quotas, and the boat needs to be destroyed. And they have to bring in
so when you read this description, what you realize is, oh, this really is about control of the food supply. We want complete, and so one of the things you point out is one of the consequences, corporatization of the food supply.
Yeah, that's an important consequence.
Because what you're destroying is all the independence.
Yes.
So and
the culture, because I don't write about that in the report, but so I knew somebody already in Urk, and he introduced me to a fisherman there. But Urk is it's a very interesting case study, but it's a very tight-knit Christian community. It used to be an island, and it's a fishing community. So you ask a fisherman, like, how long have you been doing this? And they can tell you, because it goes back, that's their whole heritage.
Many generations.
Not just many, like ages, like hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But it's also, there is the fishermen going out to sea, but it is a whole industry in the former island itself. But it's part of the whole community. So what do you do when you ask somebody to destroy this boat? Because it's not just a thing, it's your livelihood, it's your heritage.
It's your heritage, yeah.
You destroy it's the culture. It's something very, and what I realized as well, I thought, if you look at this
it's killing a world.
Yes.
Killing a world. You're killing a world, you're killing a family.
Yeah.
You're killing a field, you're killing a community, you're killing, right.
And if you look at this industry, so this land consolidation, all these uprooted people going into the cities, I thought this must have been such a homogenization of culture as well.
Right.
All these uprooted people. And that's why I was also interested in this culture at Urk. So I asked Yuri, I said, so what happened when Corona, during the lockdowns? And he said, well, the first person was diagnosed with COVID and everyone was at the tip of their toes, what is happening? And he said, but of course we know everyone's had medical history. So you know if somebody has 3 heart attacks and respiration issues. So for them, it was pretty obvious quickly who was at risk and who was not. And then they still meet in churches. They have a lot of churches. And he says, well, the Monday after church, this is going like a wildfire. What is happening in the community? And what I thought was interesting as well, he said, for us, the question that matters is not what we are doing here, but the question of eternity. And our life and our lifespan is given by God. And it's about how you live and how you come together. So if somebody is dying, you don't put them in a plastic box. But if you're dying, you're with someone, because that's our faith. That's how you support each other. But because I had a couple of other conversations with them as well, and what I realized was they had a real reality check where everyone in the cities was atomized and hypnotized by a black screen. And the only information was like death and fear and testing. And
they had a community and ended up working together.
Well, they have a different source of information.
Right.
And like a real source of information, because they see what is happening in their community. They're talking with each other. They have a sense of connection. And I think it really was a bulwark against getting so brainwashed.
Right. One of the things that frightens me the most in Urk is a perfect example. If you look at Urk and you look at that community, what you see is a group of people who would be a lot less likely to do something in terms of delivering food into the system that would poison or kill people.
Yes.
Whereas you put together a corporate system and there's absolutely no sense of caring about what happens to the consumer. It's a machine.
Yes.
And so now you're talking about people who feel an ethical obligation and a long-standing relationship with the consumer versus a machine that couldn't care less.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, so with these boats, the North Sea boats, 76 or 78 have already been applied for destruction. And there are 40 left and only 30 big boats.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was just in Urk in the port a year ago.
Okay.
And that's a phenomenal number.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so just because this is really cheerful, let's turn to impact of monetary and fiscal policy, because we've just been talking about the policy tsunami. There's another tsunami that is as arguably just as big in terms of its impact, and that is the fact that we have, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify, a central banking machine that is pumping out huge amounts of cash to the insiders.
Yes.
And all the farmers and fishermen are outsiders. They're not getting the benefit of most of that cash. There was some sort of fiscal cash coming through that machinery during the pandemic, but generally, you know, you are getting slaughtered by inflation and interest rates in a way that the insiders are protected from. So the guys who are trying to buy you out of business or put you out of business or buy your land, you know, they have a very low cost of capital, and you have a ridiculously high cost of capital.
Yes.
And this debt trap is all part of that game.
Yes. So there's a major land grab going on. So on the one hand, there's a land grab like giving all this land back to nature. So there's a UN goal to bring 30% of the land and 30% of the sea under this NGO nature protection control.
Right.
And that's an EU goal as well. Restoration goals are added to that. So 30% is protected, and then 20% restoration is added. And then you have this land grab, like basically Blackwater and asset managers, private equity, buying up.
Blackwater is the mercenary.
Oh, sorry, yes.
So you mean BlackRock?
Yes.
Well, remember BlackRock, just because the Ukraine is farmland.
Yes.
We just had BlackRock show up in Ukraine
Yes.
a month or two ago talking about how they're going to basically buy everything, invest in everything, own everything.
So a condition of the aid to Ukraine was that they would create a land market. And they've done so, and this land market, while the civilians are dying, the land is being sold off to oligarchs, to...
Right.
Yeah.
It's a huge land grab.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to consequences. Corporatization of food.
Yes.
Is one of the things that's happening. What can you tell us about, as this is going on in the Netherlands, what can you tell us about corporatization of food?
So you have this industrial model. You need to grow bigger and bigger to be able to run your farm. But at some point, your farm is very big and leveraged, and you cannot give it to your sons and daughters anymore, because they cannot take over this debt. So they can only sell it to the big players, so the large food producers. So that's how it gets into. It's one of the ways.
Who have a much lower cost of capital.
Yes.
Right.
And again, that model makes it difficult for the small farmers to get by. So more small farmers, independent farmers, are going bankrupt because of this model. Then, so you're buying up all these farms in the Netherlands, but they're buying all this land up in the east of Europe. Well, they're doing this worldwide, but for example, they will do it for large areas of land in east of Europe, and you get a corporation that is running it, and it's also devastating the communities there. They don't have the food standards. So you don't know what this cattle is being fed, what kind of medication that is being applied, what are food safety standards. So Elze van Hamelen, one of the farmers that we interviewed, said, well, here they have all these strict regulations. We have a perfect food system, or like high quality food production. And then they say, you're bad for nature, or they make up some bad for the animals. It's not as if then this production quits. They just move it to the Ukraine or some other country. and then we import it back again, and the supermarkets sell food that we are not allowed to produce because it's too dangerous. So it's bankrupting the farmers here and putting it in corporate hands there, but really lowering the quality. And
So I'm terrified of a lot of that food, just because if you dive into some of the food safety issues, the real food safety issues, not the phony food safety issues, there is so much criminality going on in the system, in the corporate system, that it is truly frightening.
Well, that's why I think, like, if there's one takeaway after reading this whole report, is really like invest in your food. Like, if you can afford it, pay a premium. And even if you're not doing it for the farmers, make sure you have a source of food where, also, even if it appears cheaper when you buy something in a food supermarket, you're financing your enemy. Like, they are part of a system of controlled food.
You're financing somebody who's in the process of killing you.
Yes.
So I'll tell you let me just go down and look at it from the subscriber's point of view. So we're working on the learning plan for building wealth. And we're working on, somebody was saying you need to give an example of a time budget, because we're talking about how to do a time budget. So I keep talking about different risk issues related to the Great Poisoning. So I said, okay, I want to do one section of the time budget where we say, okay, there's the Great Poisoning, which starts with bad food.
Yes.
And, bad water, pharmaceuticals, etc. So there's the Great Poisoning, but then there's shadow work, okay? Shadow work, if you look at the policy tsunami, a lot of it is shadow work, made up to destroy farmers' time. Then you have inflation, you have interest rates, and then you have crime/safety. So a lot of what's been happening with the immigrants in certain areas, certainly in the United States, all sorts of, okay. So I did this with one of our teammates. So you've got a man, a woman, and a baby. So I just said, let's just take the two adults. And we're just going to do last week. So that's two adults, so that's 7 hours each, a total, 7 days each. That's 14 days worth of time. So I said, okay, Great Poisoning, what happened? Well, it turned out one person had gotten food poisoning, and the other person had gotten it not as badly, but that took up 2.5 days. Destroyed productivity for 2.5 days. Then shadow work, they bought a new piece of equipment that had turned out to be faulty and had to keep waiting for the repairman to come over and fix it. That was a half a day. Okay, that shouldn't have happened. Time stolen. Inflation, they figured out, if you look at how much their food and other essential household goods had gone up over the last year, that turned into a half a days of work. So if you took the amount of money they had to pay, said, okay, how many hours do we have to work to earn that? That's a half a day. Interest rate, they're lucky. They've really protected themselves against that. So that was 0. And crime, safety, they're very savvy, smart. No bad luck, 0. So it totaled the inflation was a day, sorry. It totaled to 4 days out of 14. They had lost to the game of draining you with these different risk issues. And so if you look at this and how much food poisoning can drain, or sickness or health can drain, locking up really excellent sources of fresh food is a no-brainer.
Definitely.
Right.
Yes.
You can't afford to lose 2.5 days.
No.
Right.
And more if... So this is not in the report, but if you look at the weather in the last couple of months, I suspect that there's serious weather warfare going on.
Right.
And there are already forecasts of that the harvests will be bad. So in addition to this inflation, expect higher food prices.
Right.
So at some point, you really want to secure your access to food, and you do not want to be dependent on the supermarket or the government.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But lowering food quality is a problem too.
Yes.
Right. Okay. one of the things that's happening is we now have this invading army of NGOs, which appears to be growing. How are the NGOs in the Netherlands? Are they?
Well, that's interesting. So they're basically the implementation arm of a governance layer that a lot of people do not take into account.
Right.
So if you look both the farmers and the fishermen, but I think the fishermen are a better example. So you have these stakeholder engagement processes, which are very much like a Delphi process. The end is already determined, but they invite everyone and everyone can talk. And then they say, well, you had your say, and then they go on do what they were planned to do. These nature protection NGOs have a seat at the table. But you think, as a stakeholder, but why? Who are they representing? Well, they say civil society, but it's not civilian.
It's whoever funds them is who they really represent.
But then if you go back to this whole UN thing, then you see that a lot of these NGOs have special consultative status at the UN.
Right.
So they're part of developing these policies to give back land to nature. Then they're part of implementing, creating these protected natural areas through creating eco-regions, which is like a new governance layer above municipality and under government. So it's really created to subvert national sovereignty. And then these areas are run by these same NGOs. So they're basically an implementation arm. Not all of them, but this is a tricky thing as well. So you know this research of Corey Lynn, laundering with the immunity. So she has gone into this UN history and discovered that a lot of these UN organizations have been given, after the Second World War, diplomatic immunity and privileges.
Right.
And that means that they're kind of like have a diplomat status. So you cannot turn in a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information request. You cannot start a criminal investigation. If you want to go into their buildings, you're not, and you want to do that, you're not allowed to. The people that work for them, they don't need to show a vaccination proof or testing proof. They can just go pass freely through customs. So these UN organizations with these immunities can in some cases pass these immunities to their members. And so one of these big IUCN, like one of the biggest NGOs, and there are a lot of like municipalities, governments, they have a lot of members, but they're probably allowed to give their privileges to their members. So you have these, but they don't need to be transparent about that.
Right.
So we don't know which NGOs under them have these same privileges. So you have a kind of like an arm of the UN that's implementing this agenda, and they're protected by a wall of secrecy and immunity.
So I would say it this way: you have a tsunami of money financing a tsunami of invading armies, whether you call them government, civil service, or NGO, but a tsunami of money financing all of these people, none of whom have to be accountable on an economic basis.
Yes.
They don't have to be productive.
Well, also not on a legal basis, because they have diplomatic immunity. Like a diplomat still resides in some country, and if there's some controversy, then some. But these organizations, so the BISbank is part of this system as well, and they extend this immunity to all the central banks under them.
Right.
So you have this layer of like UN organizations, central banks, and NGOs. And if you want to start a legal case, there's no court that you can file anywhere.
Well, I would say, though, that the New York Fed's depository is still legally obligated, and the BIS can't protect them from...
Is that true?
That's what I believe.
Okay.
So, I don't put it past them to take any... But if you're running the depository function for the U.S. government, you have contractual obligations. And if you steal their money... Okay. I mean, it's very interesting. After Skidmore, published his report. And I'm assuming some of that laundering was done through the BIS, but after Skidmore published his report, it was a week or two later that there was a fire at the New York Fed on a Saturday night, which tells me they don't think they have it. So this agenda is accelerating. One of the things you cover is the rights of nature, which gets even more frightening. And I would point that Chile rejected the constitutional change that would have given rights to nature. So we are making a little bit of progress. But talk about the really frightening rights of nature. I keep hearing in my mind, wait, no, it's worse.
Well, it's so this whole protect nature because man is bad for nature agenda. The protected areas are one part, but now there's also a movement that says, well, nature they need to be protected as have a legal personality under law. And what you see so apparently in some areas they have given a river or a natural area already like legal personhood rights.
Right.
But if you then look at the changes that are proposed in the World Health Organization's international health regulations, then they say we need to get rid of human rights. And they replace that with some vague wording of like we need to protect equity and equality of all life. So they're moving from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric worldview. And all life means that a forest or a river or a toad or some animal living somewhere and a human, you have to balance their equity and their rights. They have equal rights. And they see that as something, progressive. But that's very scary because you think, who is going to protect those rights for nature? Those are the NGOs that will start these lawsuits with the tsunami of money behind them.
Right.
And there's no human rights anymore. So they're basically saying that humans don't have real intrinsic value.
So back to this bubble on top of the real assets. You have trillions of dollars of real assets owned by humans.
Yes.
And that humans use to have a decent life. And now what they're saying is all the laws that protect those rights we should throw out.
Yes.
So then we can get the real assets.
Well, that's also, it shows again, it's an attack on property rights.
Right.
Because, and they are very honest about this. Well,
Well, the property rights of the people whose land they want to steal, not the property rights of the people who are going to do the stealing.
Yeah, that's true, yes. But that's not part of their conversation.
Oh, okay.
It's like these natural areas, they need to be like, well, people are using that and they are treating it, and really the quotation marks are one of this article, they're treating this land as their property. And you think, okay. And this property needs to be protected because this meadow has rights, and how come does this person think they own it? So it needs to be protected under UN rule by NGOs.
So in the accelerating stream of wait, no, it's worse. Talk a little bit about One Health. We'll talk about the WHO, but we need to talk about both the WHO and One Health, because when you go into the WHO and you think that it can't get worse, and you add One Health and it integrates this.
So One Health is basically an infrastructure. It says that it takes again. It says almost anything can be a source of pandemic potential. So natural areas can be the environment can be a part of pandemic potential, but food production, the cattle, humans itself. So you need to put everything under genomic surveillance. And they say
So we're talking about unbelievable surveillance of everything.
Yes.
Right.
And they already created the infrastructure for this.
Right, and the BIS has put together a database of everything.
Yes.
So whether it's surveilling or tracking or having complete data and intellectual mastery on everything.
Yes.
And our money's paying for it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So with the One Health, So the way I discovered it was in the first, like one of the first proposals of the changes in the IHR. Before, if there would be a pandemic, they would call in the atomic agency. So I thought, okay, that makes sense if there's some nuclear disaster. But in the changes, they said, well, we need to include UNEP, which is the environmental arm. The IO, they have a new name now, but that's the animal part. And the FAO, which is the agricultural arm of the UN. And I thought, oh, that's all food production.
Right.
And the environment. So what does that have to do with sickness? Then you have this theory of zoonotic diseases, that diseases jump from animals to humans and all that theory. So they've been pushing this for a long, long time. And Jonge van Hamelen said, so that one of the farmers, he said, well, these farmers used to live in one farm together with a family with 11 people and their cows and their goats and everything was living in one area. And we didn't have zoonotic outbreaks then.
Right.
But now...
we had very strong immune systems.
Yes, that too. But yeah, if you look at those diseases...
Right.
Yeah. But I think the whole narrative is anything can make you sick. Everything needs to be under surveillance, and nature and humans and animals are being put on one level. So the theory behind that is zoonotic diseases, but what the narrative that's being prepared is that there will be some disease among the cows or the chickens. And so you had the bird flu, of course. They've been pushing that for some time. But that then is a reason to call a lot of animals. So I forgot the number, but like an enormous amount of chickens worldwide have been culled.
Right.
In name of the bird flu. And something I cannot completely discover, because I thought, is this another one of those pandemics that's being run by the PCR tests? Mm-hmm. And I spoke to one farmer, and he had a chicken factory who had undergone this culling. And he says, yes, they do a test, and you look, it's a PCR test. And I said, were those chickens sick? And he said, no. But then I was speaking to another farmer, and he said, yes, if they're sick, it runs like a wildfire. So I thought, what is running like a wildfire then? And I thought the most interesting explanation was from Arthur Fürstenberg's newsletter. Right. Because he's talking about Ameland, which is, or Texel, but one of the islands in the north of the Netherlands. And within a couple of months, a whole colony of birds died, like thousands of birds. But when he looked into the details, he saw that in the same period that these birds died, they placed a lot of 4G masts there. Right. And then he said, it's not always like when there are 4G masts, the bird died, but this is an area where there's a lot of traffic, like shipping traffic. And it's near sea, so the radio waves, the EMF waves get reflected. Right. So he has a couple of examples where there's basically like very high EMF and like colonies disappearing. And then one colony that's like 20 miles out, that's perfect, like in perfect health. And he said, if this is a contagious disease, then it's not possible. If we say this disease is all over Europe, so because there are examples of more birds dying, and of course these birds navigate based on the Earth's Earth magnetism. So I can imagine that these birds will be way more sensitive to all the increase in electromagnetic.
Everybody should read his book, Invisible Rainbow, because this is very much a part of what's in the mix here. And my concern is, of course, they can trigger disease using EMF. And, you know, you want to have a bird flu? Okay, well, just turn it on. Let's talk a little bit about the control grid, because what we're talking about is control of food, control of money, control of media, control of all these things. The WHO, I just did an interview with James Rogowski, because I think basically they're building an invading army that can say, Elsa, there's a pathogen in your sewer system. We have to condemn your house. You know, because you're talking about surveillance, but the ability to move in against any neighborhood or building or...
Because they're surveying all the sewage.
Right.
And then they say we see there's a viral load in the sewage, and so this neighborhood is at risk.
Right. And the next thing you know, it's very easy to pick up a lot of real estate cheap. I mean, to me, it looks like a big real estate steal, the whole thing.
It is. If you look at all the numbers and where the houses that they're buying up and the lands.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're doing it with all the fishing and farming. But if you look at what the WHO is preparing, they're building a machinery of a combination of different resources that can literally operate to control or steal the real estate anywhere on the planet. It's quite phenomenal. Except I should say that Liechtenstein and the Cook Islands are not members, so...
Lucky them.
I know. The guys in Liechtenstein really understand money, and they're very, very smart. So if you're one of the tiniest countries in the world, having to get along with all the biggest countries in the world, you get very, very smart. Anyway, smart people. Talk a little bit about, you talk about 15-minute cities and also some of the things they're doing in the Netherlands to build smart cities.
So, so again, that habitat policy, they say we need to redistribute the population over the land area. And they also say we need a redistribution of assets. And they do this through implementing all these land use policies and regulations. So that this whole trend of urbanization was not so much a natural process. It was really steered from UN policies that a lot of national governments have implemented as well. On the one hand, by making it more difficult to use your land in rural areas, and on the other hand, by stimulating these people going into cities, and then through managing how cities are being developed in the urban growth boundaries. So Rosa Query already describes how you have all these redevelopment agencies creating like housing development projects, but disowning people of their property by creating all this legislation. Like they would say like, well, this house is a blight. And there are all these regulations that you need to abide by. And she says this eminent domain, this taking the housing of the people, is being used in such a unjust way here. Like she was a real estate appraisal, and she said, well, in some cases you do need to get a road, and then you appraise this land, and you do take the land by eminent domain. So there are cases where this needs to happen, but she saw that what was happening in cities was a very big fraud.
Right.
And what you see now is this same kind of planning process is being used for the smart cities. And the smart cities are now being divided up in this 15-minute zones. And what you then have is basically kind of like open-air prisons.
Right.
Because these smart cities are full of cameras, of sensors, of IoT infrastructure. The 4G is already up. They're increasing the 5G. So there's also heavy electromagnetic pollution. And so it's becoming impossible to stay in the countryside. Right. People are going into the cities. They're bankrupting people as well, because the homeowners, they need to use solar panels and they need to comply with all these other legislations. So in the end, you do have people that can only rent. Oh, and then there's the black water is the black rock. No, but there's Blackstone.
Blackstone.
So they're buying up a lot of these. So you can only lease, but there's turning these houses that you lease into surveillance homes as well.
Right.
So this has been a policy that's been implemented over like a long time span. but it's putting people in cities that are open air prisons.
Okay, so when you read Pharma Food and you read the people who feed, or the Dutch farmers and fishermen, the people who feed us, you see the system whole. You go through the whole ecosystem, and you see the game, and you see how, what was it? The expression in America was the Indians used to say the white man speaks with forked tongue, and so the deception is, and the lies are just, and the gaslighting is remarkable. So you see the game, I see the game, but yet I'm continually baffled by talking with people in the Netherlands, how they just don't see the game.
Well, me too. But I think it requires time.
Right.
So a lot of people are sending memes to each other on Twitter. Sometimes I get a question and then I think, I cannot respond to this question in 2 sentences. And if I try to, you will misunderstand me and it will be taken in the wrong way. So, that's also why I really...
You just send them the link.
Yes, that as well. But that's why I really... I feel so grateful that you give me the opportunity to do this research. Because even in this report, there were so many areas I thought that needed a deeper dive, or I had more questions. But you really need I need these pages.
You need to map out the whole ecosystem.
Yes.
And you need Dr. Farrell says the quality of a piece is you judge by the number of footnotes. And I would say the footnotes on Pharma Food and the footnotes here are pretty extraordinary. So if anybody wants to dive into it, there's a lot more you can do. But I think our job, what I see Salira's job is to do the deep dive that really maps out the whole thing. And from there, we can start to make it simple, because we can always link back and say, if you want the detail, go there.
Yes.
And so you have the detailed map, and that puts, my hope is that this piece, and we do this a lot, you can turn to a reporter who wants to understand and cover this, but it would take them months to duplicate what you've done. But they can read your piece, and suddenly they're standing on solid ground, and they can do something in a week that's very meaningful.
I was helped. Well, there are a couple of researchers I cite here, and I kind of felt, I thought, they already saw this in the 90s. And their work has helped me so much. So they were going to the UN conferences. Right. They were going through these reports, and by reading their work, I immediately knew, that's where I need to look, or this is the key issue. So,
So we're doing that for each other. We're getting to the point where we can, somebody can put it on, maybe not Twitter, but can say it without taking up all of Sunday dinner. One of the issues that we were talking about, we don't have the answer for. If we have this game for the real assets, including the land and the real estate, we know the BIS is running the innovation hubs globally for all the CBDCs, and they're putting together a unified database of all the real assets. What we don't understand is, what are they planning on using as collateral for the CBDC? Is it humans? I think it's humans. But where do all the other assets come into play? We don't know. But there's clearly a relationship between mapping and trying to own all these assets and what the collateral will be. Because if you look at the planet right now, we have more promises of collateral than we have collateral.
Yes.
Right. Yes. So if you look at this mound of paper, the real assets have been promised too many times over, which is part of this control system is bringing that process to a unhappy conclusion. And clearly one of the critical issues is who gets the assets. If 100 more people have been promised the assets than there are assets, then who's going to get the assets?
It's like Monopoly, the bank always wins.
Well, maybe not this time.
No,
we're willing.
Sorry.
We're willing.
No, but that's what they're planning for. Well, then we get back to this nature protection.
Right.
because so I cite Henry Lamb a lot, and at some point he says, well, it sounds very strange, but they are trying to put all this land, which they say to protect, into a trust and under UN control, and that's how they're trying to control the land.
Right.
But then I remembered, so I interviewed Patrick Wood about his books on technocracy, and he says that this whole sustainable development agenda, its forerunner was the technocratic agenda. And he said those technocrats in the 30s, they devised the system and they say, well, we shouldn't have an economic system that's run by supply and demand, but we should put all the world's assets into a trust. And then the technocrats, the scientists, they will be able to devise what's an optimal usage level. And you use an energy-based currency to distribute the use of the assets. But basically, this idea of putting the assets into a trust was already in this technocrat model. And he says it's been kind of revamped into the Agenda 21,
right,
where they say we need to manage all the global commons for the sustainable development. And then Dr. Farrell posted this small piece, and he gave a comment on it. So Russia has declared the World Wildlife Fund as undesirable. And that's interesting because I've just been reading especially the World Wildlife Fund is one of the key NGOs who is kind of like creating this subversive governance layer to control land.
Right.
And the reason that they're undesirable is because they were subverting economic activity. And I can imagine that. And then Dr. Farrell quotes this man from the 80s who kind of like happened, by coincidence, he was invited to a World Wildlife conference.
Oh, this is funny. This is a funny story. Yeah.
And then you think that's kind of like a nature protecting conference. And who were there? Maurice Strong, Rothschilds. And he says like the highest of the high financiers. And in the 80s, he heard of this plan to bring wilderness areas under UN control as collateral for a world currency.
Right.
And I thought, oh, and they're really ratcheting up this agenda right now. So Russia is very, very important in this case because it has the largest world landmass.
Right. So it spans it goes, from Europe to Asia. I think it's 11 time zones. But the wealth of resources there is extraordinary. Right.
So then again, we get back to this war in the Ukraine. It's not just about this Ukraine. They need to divide. They want to divide Russia.
They need to implode Russia. If they're going to do this plan, they need to implode and get control of the assets in Russia.
Yes.
Right. And that's a big.
So it was a tiny piece of news, like the World Wildlife is ousted, but probably it's very big because the real game is about the land and the assets.
So I want to come back to what can we do, and I want to start with, I've talked with you before about the movie, The Never-Ending Story,
yes,
where the protagonist is fighting with a force in the universe called the Nothing.
Yes.
And when you look at this machinery and it touches you in your life, it's the Nothing is coming at us from every direction, and it's stealing our assets and it's stealing our time. So part of what you can do is get prepared to do war with the Nothing, because the Nothing is on the move.
Well, I noticed that actually in the last couple of days, how many people they said, well, we won't win this in my lifetime. And this guy was more than 10 years younger than I am. You think like, what? Why do you?
But we're willing to win it in this lifetime.
So.
Yeah.
But also with the farmers, like, I don't know what you can do to this. This is too big. But I really think each of us, we're all creative in our own way, but you have to step into your creativity and start doing something.
Right.
And sometimes also let go. Like if you think we need to win or not win, that kind of thought can be almost kind of blocking.
Limiting, right.
Like just thinking, okay, I'm here at this point and I do what I can do.
Right.
And I think faith helps a lot.
Right.
Like, and then...
And fresh food helps a lot.
Yes. And filter your water. But about what you can do, something very simple, go to your farmer. Like even to have the conversation. And if you're in a big city and you cannot get out to your farmer...
Go to the farmers markets.
Yes. Or like in the Netherlands, we have a lot of these networks. Like in Deventer, there's somebody who buys at all the local farms. And he brings the food to your home one day.
Well, that's what we do. We get Hofweb, so...
So, I get it directly from the farm, but I did that for a while as well. But find a way to do this. And if you're thinking about like, I want to start a business, and this kind of business is not yet in your neighborhood, I would say start that. Because... I quote also Jan Douwe van der Ploeg a lot, who's written a lot about the peasant farming, like the regenerative farming model. And he says, you have all these food monopolies, but where the peasant farms are at their best is in the margins. And these margins, they can also not touch. So if you have a direct line to your farmer or just with one person in between, and all these kind of informal local networks, and you're paying in cash, they cannot touch that. So I would almost plead for some very big campaign, like hashtag boycott agribusiness, like everything that's the corporatization of food.
Right.
Try to avoid it as much as possible. And I think you can be creative in that. So that's like a smaller personal choice. If you still have money that you invest or you're looking for investment opportunities, yes, somewhere where you can buy a farm and perhaps like even the larger agricultural farms. So right now there's policy in the Netherlands that they say, well, we want to have the regenerative model, but this will be the next policy wave that will bankrupt everyone. So perhaps like an over-leveraged farm, you buy it up with people that are knowledgeable. You will devise a plan that you say, how can we make the transition in a way that doesn't collapse food production because you cannot turn to organic overnight. Perhaps you can even divide up the land to some extent or put it in a foundation.
Well, there are different ways also. People coming in together, buying a farm, hiring a farmer to just produce and help them produce all their food for their family. So it's just private. Another farmer I remember having dinner with, she and her husband had started a farm where they were essentially providing food to a group of families at cost plus. So whatever the bill was at the end of the year plus a profit margin, that's what they got paid. Yes. And so there are ways of doing these with personal co-ops that can work.
And I think on another level, it's super important to change the narrative, because the narrative is that man is an enemy of nature and property rights are bad.
Right.
And nitrogen emissions are an issue. And if you go along with the narrative, then you get a discussion about, well, how much of nitrogen emissions are good, or how should you deal with this, yes or no?
So it seems to me a lot of the environmental problems on the planet can be changed by changing from industrial agriculture to regenerative farming in the proper way, in an evolutionary way. If you try and do it shock doctrine, it won't work. But it can be done, and it's a good economic model.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, very good. So that's actually the most food in the world, because that's the big selling story of industrial agriculture, that we need that to feed the world.
Right. So here's the problem. The problem is, how do you solve the environmental problem while asserting complete control of the full food supply? So if we just solve the environmental problems by moving from industrial agriculture to regenerative agriculture, then we can't have central control of food. That's the problem.
Yes, that's the problem.
Right. So since we don't want central control of food, it's not a problem for us, right? And that's, all these debates keep coming back is to, we have a secret governance system that wants complete control. And that's a win-lose proposition. And they either win or lose. And if they win, we lose. It's that simple.
Yes.
So part of changing the narrative is getting the whole ecosystem to see that that's the problem and it's that simple, and that's what has to be debated out, not these thousands of little complex things that have been manufactured.
Yes. So don't get pulled into the complex discussions that are designed to distract you. So a lot of there's a large piece in the report about the property rights, because I was very surprised to find that. So because I'm from the Netherlands, I do not get taught about the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. But what I found was that the declaration of everyone has the right for a pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, that it was taken from John Locke, and it was actually the pursuit of life, liberty, and property, or estate.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So, and the reason for that was that access to property was seen as a condition for freedom.
Absolutely.
And let me see if I explain it correctly. So if you have a piece of property, you can generate your wealth, you can generate your independence. But if you don't have property, you become very dependent on something else. So in this line of reasoning, it was like if your property, the only reason for the government is there to protect your property because it's a condition for freedom.
Right.
So if your property rights are taken, then it's seen as like you cannot have freedom but without that.
So it's really funny because for years now, whenever I'm with groups that talk about human rights, I keep throwing in property rights. And it's almost as though, at first I would get funny looks and I would keep saying no property rights. And then I started talking about family wealth. And they associate family wealth with rich people who are evil. So no, family wealth is the basis of democracy. It's the basis of freedom. It's the basis of everything. So I keep throwing it in the hopper. And we just had an activist who did an hour-and-a-half sort of hit job on me, which I haven't watched. But she was saying, we did a wrap up on ESG, and she thought I said the opposite of what I said. And she admitted she hadn't read it. She just assumed what I said. Anyway, but she was saying all the stuff I do on wealth is very bad. And so my retort was, you can build wealth, you can build poverty, or you can build nothing. Which do you want? And but I'm absolutely in agreement that property rights are essential for human freedom.
So apparently in the US, there's a whole property rights movement. And I collected a lot of information, but I didn't have time to read it yet. But I find it very interesting how this has been elaborated kind of like in the philosophy of law and in the Constitution, because they're taking that away. And there's this big indoctrination process that property is dirty and it's greedy. But I have this story of Jan Douwe van der Ploeg. So he describes how his grandfather was a landless worker who just went from one area to the next. And he fell in love with his grandmother, and they were engaged for 7 years, because that was how long it took to get, I think, like a pig and a cow or something like that.
Right.
And then they were able to get their tiny plot of land, and he worked very hard to expand that piece of land and that farm. And then he could send his son to school. And then this son was able to send his son to college. And so that's Jan Douwe. And he said, that's how you build autonomy. That's how you build wealth. And that's by this whole set of like legislation and rights and infringements on, like even acquiring a piece of land. That's what you're taking from people. The right to autonomous existence. And even when I was doing this research, I thought, I always assumed that the land is this way because of some sort of natural process. But when you see how orchestrated it is, I thought, why don't we have what sounds a bit like a hobbit country? Like, we don't need to live in hobbit houses. That's not... But in this Lord of the Rings, you see everyone
we need to escape Mordor.
Yes, definitely. But they have a house and they have a piece of land, like a large piece of land around. And I thought, why not? Why are we living all like so?
There's no reason not to.
No.
Right.
The only reason is because the way they devised the policy, and that if you want to control people, like if we get back to the beginning of the story, if you have all these farmers that have tiny plots of land, and each plot of land has the 30 owners, you cannot control those people. Right. But if you have a lot of people who own nothing and that are bunched up in 15 minutes smart cities, it becomes very easy to control. So I think we need to put land ownership and property rights really back to the forefront of...
Well, it gets back to the governance model. Are we gonna optimize what we do and how we do it so that we're a happy planet? Are we gonna optimize what we do and how we do it to produce the planetary dividend, which is going someplace? Yes. That's a big question for another time. Anyway, but I dare say the message of the Dutch farmers and fishermen is that somebody is trying to steal our property rights and our land.
Yes.
And we are in the same basket with the Dutch farmers and fishermen. And the question is, can we see that? And I think thanks to your map, we can see it a lot easier.
I hope so.
And can we see that? And then can we start to understand we're all in the same basket and start to help each other? But whatever we do, we need this map if we're going to risk manage our life.
Yes.
So eat fresh food and start looking in your community, in your jurisdiction, how are you going to protect your property rights?
Yes.
Because they're coming.
For everyone.
Yeah,
yes.
They're coming for everyone. So.
And the operation is that everyone thinks it's them individually.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And although each person is unique in this aspect, we share the same enemy. Okay, well, Elze, this has been absolutely fantastic. The full piece is up on the website, and it will be converted into a PDF. The Pharma Food's in the PDF. Mm-hmm. This will be up in text with the graphics on the website. We'll convert it into a PDF and then get it into the printer behind Pharma Food. And the two of these are really, they're just a blockbuster. So I can't, we're very grateful because it's hard to find people who can really do what you do. It's pretty special. So, and you even
I love doing this.
Yes. Anything else you want to tell us before we?
No, I think we covered it. Yeah,
we covered it.
But you really need to read the whole, 60 pages because it's one story.
Yeah. And so now that this is done and on the way to through the editor, you're off for a vacation. That's very well deserved. So have a wonderful time. And
thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Solari Report. So ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we think you're eating healthy, fresh food at the Solari Report is very, very important. And so we are delighted to have the opportunity to bring this to you. And thank you for joining us.